Hello and welcome to another LinkedIn Live with myself, Garth Sharif. Hope everyone is doing well out there, and I'm glad you can join me for another AI themed LinkedIn Live. It's been a few of them because it's just so pertinent and in the news on people's minds, and I've been thinking about it a lot more. And I'm just doing a quick audio check. Sounds okay. So I always want to make sure that I can be heard. So hopefully everyone's doing all right out there. And today I wanted to talk about AI and learning. And it makes sense to talk about this in a few different ways. When we talk about artificial intelligence and generative AI, this is a form of learning. A lot of times we break down artificial intelligence into two branches of what's called weak AI. So that's either machine learning or deep learning. Machine learning and deep learning are related. But for artificial intelligence to be where it is today with ChatGPT and Google's Bard and other generative AI programs that are really coming along with other existing programs. For example, I talked about Grammarly, which I use to check my grammar and spelling. It's starting to have a beta version where it can actually write my emails almost in my own voice. It's I have options, and it's interesting, right? And part of this is the ability for programmers to have artificial intelligence learn and provide a particular output. And I listened to a podcast with Ezra Klein, and I'm a big fan of Ezra Klein. I think his work is really interesting. And the podcast was about adopting the beginner's mind. And really, do we lose the beginner's mind? And I'll show you the transcript from that from the podcast, which you can get on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, part of the Ezra Klein show. And in it, he talked to Dr. Alison Gopnik, who is a professor of psychology out of UC Berkeley, and she focuses on how children learn and their development. And this conversation was really illuminating to me and got me to think in a couple of ways. So, one, I highly recommend either reading the transcript or listening to the episode, because there's two ways to look at the episode, and Ezra did a great job framing it in both ways, and it made me think in both ways. First, let's go into us as individuals in an ever changing environment. I think we always deal with uncertainty and challenges in our environment, but coming out of the pandemic, now we have generative AI and ChatGPT and Google's Bard and other sort of very swift changes, the hybrid workplace. All of these bring a lot of uncertainty and require a level of resilience and adaptation from adults. And that can be hard. We're good at that at times, but it's not easy. Not as easy as it is for children. And that's what Dr. Alison Gopnik and Ezra Klein, they started their conversation talking about the beginner's mind. And I work in the learning space, right? I try to impart learning. I try to learn myself and then impart learning like I'm doing here on this LinkedIn Live. And what was interesting about the conversation is just the one of the conversations was on explore versus exploit and the value between that. As children, we are we're exploring. We are looking to obtain new information. We're playing with information. We don't know what to make of certain things that adults take as certainty. So there's a lot of play and exploration. And there's value in that as the way adults see it, because it eventually leads to the exploitation of the knowledge you get from exploring. So what it is this spectrum of where we are as humans. At the beginning of our lives as children, we're in this explore phase. And a lot of the times we think of it, and this is the conversation, Dr. Alison Gopnik talked about this, we see it as like we're getting smarter as we move from exploration to exploitation, so that once we have knowledge and we understand how to use it, we exploit it to earn a living, to create things that are useful in the world. And what the tenet of this conversation was is that the explorer side of ourselves, what's called the beginner's mind, is something that we shouldn't necessarily see as we getting past that as we grow into adulthood. Like the explorer is a child, that's great, they're having fun, they're exploring, but ultimately their exploration is leading to how they will eventually exploit their knowledge and earn a living and develop and all these other things that we do as adults. And Alison Gopnik and Ezra had the conversation, and this is part of her research and her books, that we should look at children not necessarily as, we're as we grow and accumulate knowledge, we're getting smarter. Just a different phase of consciousness, and we shouldn't discount the child's consciousness as they have more of the explorer brain, because that is actually very helpful for us as adults, because we lose that explorer brain to some degree. It's there, but it's not as fluid, it's not as accessible. And why that's important to look at children and research children and understand that children actually are very, very smart. They're just their brain is just more in the explorer mode. They're extremely intelligent, but we don't necessarily value that intelligence because it's not exploiting. It's not. We can't really exploit that knowledge at that child play explorer phase to do anything. Let's just say at the basic level to earn a living. But we shouldn't discount it, because that stage of development is absolutely fascinating. And it was fascinating listening to Dr. Alison Gopnik and Ezra talk about it, because most of us think of ourselves when we start our day, when we use our expertise and our knowledge, it's about how to exploit that knowledge, how to use it to get things done, how to use it for productivity, for our job, to get a new job, to do well at our current job. But that explorer phase is really important, because what children do better than adults is they deal better with uncertainty, different circumstances, unexpected situations, because they're always exploring. They're always looking at ways to see things in ways that we haven't, like we as adults have maybe settled in and seen as only one path, but children see many different options. And why that's important to explore and to also, and I keep using sport, but to investigate, but and also see if we can transfer a little bit of that to adulthood, is that in a time of great change, and most times there are great changes, generally I think the time that you're in, you feel the most amount of change, is to understand that if we access that explorer brain, we might see more possibilities to deal with all the uncertainty and changes that are happening. And again, the confluence of things coming out of the pandemic, sort of a new social normative with the hybrid workspace and technology, the the exploiting part of our brain might not be able to exploit this well, because we don't necessarily understand what is happening. We don't have this knowledge. So we really need to start to explore. But if we are exploiting first, we might feel panic. We might feel that we are boxed in. We must do things the old way, because that's how we used to really exploit our knowledge, is knowing what we did in the past. And with all these changes, that knowledge becomes discounted to some degree. So that was a really interesting conversation. And I feel it too. I feel the stress of always exploiting knowledge. And I don't know if you can let me know the idea that gaining new knowledge or being in a place of play where you really say to yourself, I'm just going to explore and play with no goal. Because if you put a goal on it, you're exploiting. No goal, but just to see if I can do that, and then whatever comes out of that. And the idea is that what comes out of playing sometimes, if you really do true play, is the ability to be more resilient, flexible, and be in a better state of mind to deal with just unexpected things that are happening. So generally, as professionals and adults, we are in more of an exploit mode, and I think that in the conversation with Ezra Klein and Dr. Gopnik was around sort of the feeling of stress that comes with that. Always having to look at the knowledge that you currently have and then new events that are occurring and how understanding how to exploit your knowledge that you currently have into those new events. And yes, there's learning, right? But it's not necessarily explorer learning. It's still learning to exploit, and how much stress that can give us. And also somehow, for a lot of us, resistance to change, resistance to things that are happening. So that was one part of the learning conversation. And for me, one, it also reflected on my children, and if I actually push them too far into the exploiter framework as children who should really be exploring and be filled with ideas and be open, because there is a lot of change for them, and they get a lot of what they need from parents, based on this conversation and the work of Dr. Gopnik, from us being providers and providing security. And sometimes as parents, we want to really make sure that they are ready to exploit. Like, are you learning? Are you passing tests? Are you hitting these milestones? Because you have to be ready to exploit in this world. Otherwise, the world will gobble you up. And her research indicates that might actually unsettle a lot of children into their adulthood. That eventually we all make a move into the exploit part of our brain, but we really need to let the play part, the exploration part, be fertile ground for children. And for us as adults, even the beginner's mind is something that we lose. A lot of us lose, including myself, and we want to be able to access in certain times, especially times of uncertainty. So I highly recommend the podcast. Ezra actually had this as a re-listen, recorded the podcast in 2021. I think it was for two reasons, if I read between the lines. Um, yeah, so that's right. The yoga mentality from Suzanne. That is exactly right. The yoga mentality is this, and I also do yoga as well. This ability to shift between play and explore, and have that throughout the time that you're doing yoga. And yoga is actually a really interesting example, because if you try to exploit with yoga, which is like you learn different positions, different flow, Astanga yoga, different sequences, and then eventually, if you're part of the Western world, you want to exploit. That means you want to take the knowledge that you have and do something with it, do better with it. And what I find with yoga is that it gets harder to do yoga. It gets harder to breathe, which is a huge central tenet of yoga, because you're starting to exploit, and with exploiting, it becomes expectations. It becomes a little bit rigid, and a big part of yoga is being flexible. So that's a really interesting point there. Sometimes we can practice playing and exploring through different mediums such as yoga, breath work, but also just playing with your kids. So it's hard in a world where we're constantly required to do things and have expectations. It is hard to adopt the beginner's mind, because it does feel like an opportunity cost. And this is from someone who works in the learning side of things in professional development, where for me, sometimes learning is about exploiting. I learn something to be able to turn it into a course, turn it into something I can provide to others. And so I also feel that a sense that I'm learning with a purpose, but am I really exploring the concepts that I'm learning? It's hard. It's hard. I think listening to the conversation with Ezra and Dr. Gopnik, I think their main tenet, their main point was it is good to find time to play, to explore, and not to always feel like you have to exploit, especially in a world where things are changing. Not easy, but I think listening to the podcast gave me some sense of, okay, when I just truly do something to play, with no expectations. There was a part of that with ChatGPT at the beginning, right? I'm like, I'm just going to check this out. I have no idea what this is in terms of where it's going to go. I'm just going to play, just ask questions, and really with no expectations, and just to explore, truly an explorer mentality. But how quickly with ChatGPT that changed to, okay, now everyone's talking about it. We got generative AI. How do I exploit this? How do I use this? How do I do something with it? And in that you lose a little bit of the ability to see, some of the SWOT analysis that comes with it. But it's not a it's not an unexpected transition when there's a lot of time pressure on us to take knowledge and learning and immediately deploy it. So I thought this was good to say, let's take a step back and let's let's um let's think about that. It's hard to do. But the other part of it, so there's a duality to this conversation, was one a bit reflective of us as people learning. And I just thought, boy, that beginner's mind sounds amazing. And it also made me very nostalgic to be a kid again. Like I have two children, and they go to school and they see kids playing in the playground, and obviously they have their own challenges, with growing up and learning. But that sense of play, I miss it. I miss it. I mean, I'm nostalgic to it. It's just when you see it with kids and the way they look at things differently, and the way that you see the world, without all the rules that we install on it. It's really nice and calming to see that. But it's not easy for adults to access. But this explore exploit model, I think, is important to just think about, as adults. And I'm gonna make sure I read one of Dr. Alison Gopnik's works. I believe her book, her most recent, is The Gardener and the Carpenter, which explores this. And it's more about psychology, about children and the way they learn and their relationships to adults. But what Ezra was doing, which I appreciated, was extrapolating that to how we learn as adults. So the duality of the conversation, the way in which it broke into two pieces, was Dr. Alison Gopnik, who's at Berkeley, where they do a lot of AI work at Berkeley. She's also been brought in to help with artificial intelligence work and to help AI learn. And she brought some insight into that. And what she brought into it was that AI and generative AI and other types of machine learning are more like adults, right? And the reason why we haven't had a super leap, and we might have one, is that AI cannot think like children. Once they start thinking like children, we will have the greatest leap in technology, in human history, probably. Right? Children, when they look at a situation, for example, she described how AI can learn, for example, as they programmed to learn the differences between images of dogs and cats. The programmers will give them images, they'll give them the information to eventually, with 100% accuracy, know what a dog versus a cat is if they're presented images. But if you change the way in which they're looking at the image, if you have the image as a moving picture of a dog, if you have something abstract, they're lost. The AI is lost. They don't know what to, because they're exploiting knowledge. AI is generally on the exploiting side. The programmers are giving knowledge to generative AI, machine learning, deep learning, to exploit it, to use it. And so it's very good at doing that, unless it's presented with a circumstance which is a little different, a little abstract, a little not part of the structure. And that's where, just like adults, it struggles. It struggles to be resilient, to figure out a different way of looking at it. Whereas children, if they're given different images and said, tell me a dog and cat, they can do that just like AI. But if they're presented with a dog in a clown suit, or some other image that has the representation of a dog, they'll be able to identify that. They'll be able to say, oh, my mind is open to all these possibilities and is not necessarily in one space. So what she has been trying to do, is try to get AI into this sort of, more of the explorer mentality. Because with generative AI and other AI, you have the alignment problem, where the values of the AI are more exploiting, and sometimes it contradicts our own value system, which changes from time to time. And she brought up the paperclip example, where you said you tell an AI program, make as many paperclips as possible, maximize the number of paperclips that are out there. And eventually, if it understands everything should be a paperclip, turn people into paperclips, animals into paperclips, the planet into a paperclip, which would, mean the death of all living things. And it's an alignment problem, because it's incentivized to exploit the knowledge it has to maximize its outcome, but it doesn't necessarily explore what we're truly maybe asking for. And we even see this with ChatGPT to a degree. ChatGPT is the best at masking that it's still an exploiting AI program. It does feel like there is some underneath of it, some sort of exploration, but it's still exploiting knowledge it's grabbing from other places. And so to me, that conversation was interesting because that is also why we are still fairly relevant, and why the beginner's mindset is still like the ability to brainstorm, creativity that comes from a lot of the exploration is so important and still ahead of AI. Like what she described, Alison, Dr. Gopnik, is that a child is still smarter than AI when it comes to like being creative, to dealing with something that isn't part of the exploitation spectrum of an output. A 2 year old, 3 year old, 4 year old, they're going to be better, right? And what that tells me is that we absolutely should exploit generative AI and AI solutions, but it's still not there with the exploration part. This is the part that we need to bring into this and work together with AI, and also be somewhat cautious when we have outputs from AI, because it's still more of the exploitation state, and sometimes the nuance of what we're looking for or asking for in the explorer brain isn't always there. So I thought it was interesting. It was an interesting podcast to look from those two sides. What learning in the beginner's mind and the exploration side of things means to adults, and how we lose that over time, and how important it is to children, and how children's intellect sometimes is undervalued because they're in an exploration phase, that we want to pull them eventually into the exploitation phase. But that's a really powerful type of intellect and consciousness, and something that we might need to really tap into in a time of uncertainty and great change. And then the other side of it is how AI is still not there with exploring. It's still more of an exploitive in the sense that it's taking information with a specific purpose, and again in ways that are highly sophisticated and pretty amazing with what we're seeing with generative AI, but still not there with exploration. Even though Dr. Alison Gopnik and others are trying to move it into that space, into the space that it can learn and think like children. And that will be the space that we might start to see weak AI, which I talk about, which is still generative AI, move into strong AI, where we start to think that AI might have some sentience, some consciousness, but it's not there yet. That is part of the development, but it's interesting to look at that, and how much a child can really teach us. So thank you for watching this one, and I just thought this was interesting to talk about it just from my point of view as a learning provider and where we are. I think the takeaway from this is for us as individuals to remember to take time to explore, and that might also lessen some of the stress in a time that is getting harder and harder to necessarily exploit our existing knowledge, as things are changing so rapidly with technology and the way we work, that our existing knowledge we can always exploit sort of at the foundational level, but we might need to explore, to just open-ended exploring, so that we can maybe deal with things that are happening that we weren't expecting in better ways. And then with technology, that we are still, we're still using generative AI. Generative AI is not using us, and we still need to have that human mind on top of generative AI, because it is not exploring. It does not have that capability, and we should be exploiting it and its exploitations. Um, and just be aware that when we have outputs from generative AI, it's going to be amazing, maybe 90% of the time, but that 10%, it's missing that element that's really important for us, that we bring as humans in our decision making and our creativity and our judgment. All right. That is it for my LinkedIn Live today. I'd like to thank you for watching. It was a little late to start this morning because it was one of those days where I was exploiting information, trying to get things done in the background, and had some issues getting set up. But I'll be more prompt. It was a couple minutes late to start today. So hopefully, wherever you are, you're enjoying the spring, moving into summer weather. If you're a sports fan, I'll end with the sports. We're sad about the Toronto Maple Leafs here in Toronto. That was sad, but to all the other sports teams in their relative playoffs, I'll send a tip of my cap to my Boston colleagues whose teams are doing well, or at least one team, the Celtics, are doing well in the NBA playoffs. All right, so thanks for watching. We'll be taking next week off. Next week, I'll be taking off from LinkedIn Live. I might have one on Thursday, but we'll be back on the following Tuesday for LinkedIn Live. Thanks, everybody, for watching. And until the next time, we'll also put the links for the Ezra Klein transcript and some other links from this podcast on LinkedIn Live. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Take care.